Hello everyone. I apologize for not speaking in Polish, but my Polish language is not that good. Hopefully my English will suffice. I've had type 1 diabetes for about 40 years, over 40 years so far. And in the last decade, I've got a lot more into the technology behind things. So in 2017, I set up my own closed loop system, initially with OpenAPS. Later on, I transferred to Android APS, and those use the same underlying OREF algorithm. Today, I use a thing called Lotus, which is an application we've built that uses the same algorithm, but we're using that in some clinical trials in Australia and New Zealand, trials of the algorithm. So we're not trialing the program. It's like Android APS in some extent, but it has lots of infrastructure for measuring things that the researchers wanted to know. So you'll see there, Nascence Biomed, that's the company that's providing this open source infrastructure for the clinical trends for the trials. But the things I'm going to talk about today apply to all of those systems. And a lot of my research and prototyping over the years has, of course, been done on my own experience. So let's talk about some of the mechanics of this. Yep. Now I have to wait for it to change. There we go. For a closed loop system to run, it really benefits from tracking how much insulin is on board. If it thinks I need to dose you for a change, then it probably should remember that it dosed us for half that change 5 minutes ago. Back in the old days of pumps and pump calculators, there was a simple linear model. We would tell the system that the insulin lasted for 4 hours or 5 hours. If we told it 4 hours, it would expect that after a bolus, 2 hours after a bolus, half of that would be gone. It was just a straight linear calculation. You can actually see in this graph here, it's linear down to a certain point at which the software said, oh, there's a little tail. It's all too hard. I'm just going to ignore that. Because this was just used for boluses, which were typically meal boluses or correction boluses. It wasn't keeping track of basal insulin because that was just regarded as a background thing that stayed the same all the time. In looping, we actually vary the basal all the time, and we want to track every piece of insulin. So just as a point here, 4 or 5, maybe 3 hours were numbers that were often used for this. No one would even think of using 9 hours because insulin didn't last that long, and I'll come back to that point later. With the OpenAPS systems in 2017 or so, 2016, whatever, we started using an exponential decay model where it's not a straight line. It decays away, and then there's a long tail of it, that little bit that hangs around that was all too hard for the other calculators to deal with. So that green line I'm using there is for the settings that I use for Nova Rapid. And as you can see, it's fairly close to that old 4-hour linear model, at least for the first few hours, and then it diverges a bit. So there were 2 parameters that defined this. One was the time to peak activity. So how long after the injection is it having the most effect? And really that's when it's being used the fastest. So when this slope is the steepest. And for Nova Rapid, that's regarded as 75 minutes. So 1 hour and a quarter. And then the duration, this is a fairly long duration on this one, and I'll show you how that comes together. The formula that this software uses, that Android APS and other software uses those 2 parameters. And as you can see here, there's a difference if we say 5 hours or if we say 9 hours, which is that green one. So with 5 hours, and a lot of people I've seen come to Android APS and say, I used to use 5 hours, I should use 5 hours. But if it's a different number, it's not the same duration. So if you feed 5 hours as the duration into Android APS, you'll get that brown dashed line. And the effect of that is that, for example, at 3 hours, it says there's a bit over half the amount of insulin still left that the other model says. At 5 hours, it says all of it's gone. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, that little tail at the end, that long, thin tail that's heading right out to the right, it doesn't matter. No one's going to notice that. But it actually turns out that this calculation is being done for every single dose in the system, and they all add up over time. So after you've had quite a few units on board for a meal, it's not unusual some hours later for the IOB calculation to be wrong if this formula isn't right. So how did I choose 9 hours? I started off with taking the formula out of the software and putting it into a spreadsheet. And then I could draw these graphs. And suddenly the numbers made sense. And for a 5-hour duration, or a 6-hour duration, 7 hours, 8 hours, you can see the line is subtly different. Now, I'm going to work at the moment on the assumption that the formula is a valid approximation and try and find the best numbers that make it match what actually happens in reality. So I would run with a closed loop operation, and I'd see over days, weeks, if there was a pattern of getting unexpected lows some hours after meals. Because if the system is underestimating how much insulin is on board, it's probably going to say, oh, I need to dose you a little bit more. And then suddenly our blood glucose drops through the floor and we say, well, where did that come from? And then I'd say, all right, let's rejig the number and go back and try again. What I actually ended up doing, rather than saying, well, try 5 hours, try 5.5, try 6, that's very slow and tedious. It takes a very long time. I would jump a little bit. I would do an interval search. So I'd be at 6 hours and I might say, well, maybe 7 hours is right, but I'll try 8 and see if there's still a problem there. And if it's gone too far and the system isn't bringing me down because it believes I've got more insulin on board than there is, I'll try 7. So it was a back and forward search. Also, as you can see here, the distance between the 8 line and the 9 line is very small compared to the distance between the 5 hour and the 6 hour. So when we get out to 8 hours, it's pretty close. When I get to 9 hours, it's actually not that much of a change. It could actually be that 10 hours was the right number, but I gave up at 9 because everything seemed to work. So that's one of the shortcomings of measuring things by observation of what's happening. I can't actually measure how much insulin is in me. I can just see its effects. So that was Nova Rapid, 75 minutes peak and a 9-hour duration. What happens if I go to the other extreme, or an extreme of a fast insulin? And in fact, I couldn't get Liumjev in Australia. We still can't get it. I managed to get some from a friend overseas and thought, right, I'm going to see if I can use this properly. Just looking at the formula and the calculations, all those lines are a lot closer together. There's not that much difference between declaring 5 hours or 9 hours. There is a bit when we get down to 3 to 4 hours. It's about a factor of 2 difference between these. When we get out to 6 hours, one will say there's a tiny bit left and one will say there's nothing. I've actually ended up using 9 hours for all the different insulins I've tried. And again, it's been working well because the 9-hour absorption, what's going through my head is most of that is due to the subcutaneous delivery. And some of it may take a very long time to make it from the subcutaneous tissue into the bloodstream and into be used. This is dramatically different from the way the body's normal insulin works, where it goes straight into the portal vein and into the liver and gets used straight away, and it's straight on and straight off. The fact that it's subcutaneous delivery gives us this long tail, and it seems to be really fairly consistent across all the insulins. So the next question was 45 minutes actually right? Now, a lot of people reported problems with Liumjev stinging too much and maybe causing reactions. Certainly people had reactions to Fiasp. So I thought, I'll try blending my Lyumjev with Humalog, it's the same insulin. The only difference is one of them has the accelerant in it. So essentially do a 1-to-1 blend, fill the reservoir with half of one, half of the other. It's still U100, but we end up with a lower concentration of the accelerant. Now, it used to be with Fiasp, people said, all right, let's try Fiasp and Novorapid. Oh yes, I don't get as many reactions. It still seems to be fast, so let's just use it at 55 minutes like we do with normal Fiasp. That's what they used to do. I thought, in my experimentation, I found with this that 45 minutes wasn't exactly right. 48 minutes was best. And I thought, well, maybe 48 is right for plain Lyumjev as well. Actually turned out that when I got to switch to plain Lyumjev, 45 is actually better. So that slight difference in the accelerant concentration does seem to make a difference. Now, I don't actually know that 48 minutes is the best number. Maybe it's 48 and a half. Maybe it's 49. Maybe it's 47. 48 is pretty close. So that peak time has a big impact on the graph. This is just the same IOB graph, looking at it again at Novorapid, Fiasp, and Lyumjev. And these are the peak times that Android APS defaults to when you select the different insulin types. Even if they don't default the duration, they default these peak times, and those have been working well for me with 9 hours. Those have proven to be good numbers, but what about all the other insulins? So I'm a little bit of an experimenter, and over quite a few months, I did a few experiments. So Novorapid and Humalog seem to both work at 75. And this is being on one of these insulins for a month or so. When I knew how one of the others had worked and what sort of time was working for it, I had an expectation of what sort of numbers might be in the right ballpark. So it didn't take me long to narrow down where it was on each one. When I'd started using Fiasp, I actually blended that with Humalog. So I thought, well, is that actually the same as Novorapid? And no, in my brief investigation, it seems to be slightly slower. Apidra, slightly faster than Novorapid. Android APS says it's the same as Novorapid, and as you can see, it's fairly close. But then we hear people saying it's faster. In my experience, it's slightly faster. So I've put a lot of experimentation into these. I have quite a few friends who've taken these numbers and used them as the starting point of their own experiments. And by all reports, they seem to be working well. So it makes me feel like I might have actually done the right work. But it's not a clinical trial result. It's just an N=1. There's only one of me who's been coming up with these numbers. So just take it with a grain of salt. But there's a little bit more to it than just these numbers. We have, if I take all those numbers and put them on a graph, there we go. You can see we've got 8 lines there, 8 insulins. 2 of the lines are exactly the same because they're both 75 minutes. I do find that putting things in graphical form helps a lot in actually realizing what's going on. As you can see here, the difference between, 72 minutes for Apidra, the blue line, and 75, so that's 3 minutes at the wider end. So if I get my mouse in here, hopefully you might see it. So the 3 minutes at the slower end, now my mouse has gone away, I will try to hover it in the right position, is less significant than the 3 minutes that's with difference between 45 and 48. So as things get shorter and shorter, the significance of those extra minutes becomes larger. So the difference between 72 and 75 is not that great. The difference between 63 and 65 is pretty marginal. Now, another way of looking at that data would be the activity. This is the slope of the graph. And you've probably seen graphs like this. Android APS will show you in one of its plugins both of the graphs, IOB and activity for the current insulin. So this is the same numbers. You can see here the peak. You can actually see the peak, which is that peak time of either 45 minutes through to 75 minutes. The area under the graphs is all the same. So every unit of all of these insulins is still a unit. It's going to have the same effect in the end. Some of them have more effect early on. So in the short term, the faster insulins feel stronger. More of the insulin gets used sooner, even though they all get the same in the end. So I found that I had to change my bolusing when I started using the faster insulins. And I do this by varying the ISF, the sensitivity factor, and the carb ratio a bit. And I've come up with a rule of thumb as to how much I should vary them by. So I'll explain how that works. So we'll start off with this graph, which we've seen before. It's the insulin on board. So the insulin on board is how much is below the line. That's how much is left. If we think about what's above the line, that's the insulin that has been used already. So if I turn the graph upside down, we end up with the insulin use graph. There we go. So this is how much has been used. And I've been finding the comparison between how much has been used at 2 hours it's very useful. So for Nova Rapid, you can see where that dashed line is. There's about 50% of the insulin has been used after 2 hours. With Lyumjev, it's 75. So that's about 50% more has been used. So I tell the system that my ISF is 1.5 times larger, and as a result, it's going to give me boluses that are 2/3 the size. It's going to, that insulin is going to have the same effect within that first 2 hours. There is going to be a difference later on, but the loop ends up cleaning up any difference in the bolusing. It can vary the basal, it can turn things on and off later on and tune things. But if I didn't do this, I would find that I'd either end up on a roller coaster because my ISF was the wrong value, or again, I might end up high and not coming down because it wasn't giving me enough insulin when I'm changing between types. When I do this, I change the timing of the insulin and I change the ISF and the carb ratio by the same amount, and everything just works. I can switch from one insulin to another and it works very well. So that's just one number. I may as well show you what the maths says based on those earlier minutes of timing. So you can see here that FIASP at 65 or 66% versus Nova Rapid is 50%. So that's 1.3. So I would be increasing my ISF by 30% when I go from Nova Rapid to FIASP. It's not a huge difference. It does work for giving food boluses, but the other thing that's happening here is I'm now doing this in a system where I don't bolus. I think of getting this, getting the insulin profile working and reliable as the foundation for the rest of the system. So I'm now using the system where in the last 2 years, I no longer count my carbs. I just eat food. I try to eat sensibly. And I can do that on the slower insulins. It's a lot easier on the faster insulins, and dealing with exercise is easier on the faster insulins because the IOB drops away more quickly. I'll just show you some of the results of that. So, like I said, getting the foundation right, I think helps a lot. This is my last month or so. This is me not announcing food. And I've done this, these particular timings stats were coming out of Lotus, but I've got similar results with Android APS, and this is not using any of the fancy boost and other algorithms. They may do better things. This is just based on doing the groundwork of getting the timing right. So, as the subtitle of the talk I had, every day is an experiment, that's what happens. As long as we record data and we keep some notes of what we've been using, what happened, and we can see patterns of, I'm suddenly going low late in the evening or in the middle of the night. Why would that be happening? Going back and looking at patterns, we can suddenly say, oh, maybe we should change something and hopefully change the right thing. I've seen a lot of people play with insulin durations and guess as to what numbers they should be using and say, oh yeah, it seems to work, but not actually go back and try a different set of numbers. Hopefully these numbers and the method is useful to someone else. That is the end of my presentation. I didn't actually look at how many minutes. I've probably spoken very quickly.
Yeah, actually, you've been quite quick here.
I've run through it very fast.
Yeah, sure. David, I have to say that this kind of thing, things you do, yeah, the things you do, if it comes to testing with all the data you gather and put this on the screen, all the Excel thing you are doing, it's quite remarkable because we live in times when the most important thing about what we do is how much data we have. We can then decide which insulin to use, what kind of ESF we should store, or how much carbs we can even eat. So it's really like Chris Wilson last year about dynamic ESF and his algorithms. He said, I had to see all of the data in a three-dimensional model to find the right resolution for my model, for my dynamic ESF algorithm. And here you say 9 hours, 9 hours. It's like this long acting insulin inside of our organisms is kind of a thing that we don't talk about often with our doctors, with our with people, that the long tail is very important.
Most people's brains go back to that old model of saying it can't go for 9 hours. There's hardly any insulin happening out there. But if you look at the maths of what the algorithm is doing 9 hours is when it gets to absolute zero right out at the end. So yes, there's a long tail, and the 9 hours actually matches pretty closely the old 4-hour model.
I think here in Poland, or even on the whole world, we have a little. There's not so big. There's not a big number of people that take this to the think about it and even put this inside their Android APS applications. We still are working on the 5 hours model. So like. I'm gonna change it today because I think I'm on 5 hour.
Well, one thing to take away from this is if you change the timing, you may have the same issue of needing, or a similar issue of needing to change your ISF, because the system will assume that the insulin is hanging around more. It's going to have more effect or less effect. So if you change your timing, be prepared to also tweak your ISF a bit if you need to. So keep your eye out for that.
Yeah. The things that I want to make a big thing out of is the most important thing about your collection, and the thing I want to say is that when you go into Android APS, when you go into your closed loop systems and so on, it's only the beginning of your work. You have to tune your ISFs, you have to work with the data, work with the all of the factors that are important for your organism to work well, and for your diabetes to be in the time and range most of the time. And the other thing is that you just have to you have to look inside your body and know when and how the insulin changes your today's life. Because when I look in on my history, when I started looping, when I started Android APS and all of the crazy stuff that are now mostly working with me, I saw that when you you have your ISF perfectly. You have your carbs counted perfectly. Today, tomorrow, same ESF, same carbs, same insulin, and everything is like blown away. So you have to work every day. Every day is an experiment. It's very important.
Yeah, in different ways. I did see a question there about which CGM am I using. Currently, I'm using Dexcom G6. I have used Libre in the past. I've used a bunch of others, but not for long periods. In terms of tuning ISF, there's a very useful article that I first read in 2017, written by Katie DeSimone. And so if you Google for Katie's name, and it's called Fine Tuning CGM Settings, and it talks about tuning the basal rate and the ISF and the carb ratio. And I would read it and I'd say, oh, this makes great sense. I will do some of these things. And 6 months later, I'd go back and read it and say, oh, I forgot about that bit. So it's a continual learning exercise, because we assume, oh yeah, I've got that, I'll just move on to the next thing. I've seen a lot of people come to looping and say, they say, I want what David's got. I'll get the system, I'll plug it in, and then I won't have to do anything. It'll take care of everything for me. I put a lot of investment into learning about the system and learning how to tune it. You were saying the ISF and the carb ratio, you might think you've got those right, but you have to remember that those are layered on top of the foundation of your basal rate. Because if your basal rate actually gives you more insulin than you actually need right now, then your correction doses will be smaller, and you'll think, oh, it was the right correction dose, but actually your basal was off slightly. So there's all these layers, and getting the insulin timing is I think one of the lower layers. Getting the default basal right is one of the next layers. And then, yes, we have hormones that change all the time, and suddenly there's other things going on. So yes, every day is slightly different.
Do you have some kind of tutorial on your blog if it comes to tuning some of the factors?
Not specifically. As I mentioned, I still refer people back to Katie's article about tuning ISF and so on. I find with tuning basal, some people will stop and do they'll go into open loop, they'll turn the loop off, and they'll see if their basal settings, they'll try and fast for the entire day and see if their basal settings are right. I haven't done that for a very long time. I did have to have a colonoscopy in recent history, so I did fast for a long time, and I was very happy that my basals were about right. I tend to go back and look at the system either on the Android APS screen or in Night Scout, and you can see the records of the insulin on board. So the IOB is 0 when it's just what your default basal had. So if the system is constantly running with a negative IOB, that's a sign that the system is having to take away insulin from what your default is to keep you at target. So that's a sign that maybe at that time of the day, my basals need to go up. And if your positive IOB is consistently positive and there's not extra food going in or something, then maybe I need to bring it down. Do need to look over multiple days. You can't just look at one day and say, oh, I need to change it, because tomorrow is probably different. But if you see a pattern, I've gradually over time tweaked different slots of my basal rate up and down a little bit until everything evens out. And that's remained fairly consistent for me. I will sometimes go back and look, and after a month, just change a couple of bits, but it's reasonably consistent. I'm well past the stage of having growth hormones going on, so that's not so much of a problem for me.
Okay, you said that you're not counting carbs. That's really shocking. But I have another question. What about sports? Are you my model? Are you my model, or are you Maya's model? I run woman?
I'm probably somewhere in between. For me, it's a 17-kilometer bike ride to the office, 17-kilometer commute on my bike, and 17 kilometers back. And I do that at an average speed of, according to my Garmin, an average speed of 29 kilometers an hour. I tend to ride reasonably hard, not all the time, a couple of times a week. And I do tell the system that I'm exercising. I use things like temp targets and exercise mode so that it's not going to overreact and try and reduce the amount of insulin beforehand. So it's not fully closed to that extent. I'm warning it that I'm going to do some exercise, but I'm certainly not telling it about any food.
Happy you answered that, because it was the other question I wanted to ask. How about your looping? How do you work with the looping stuff? Miroslava Sedegari, I think you know her.
Oh, yeah.
She has a question. Do you agree in adult, once you find your basal pattern, that you just lower or higher percent if needed?
Mostly. Sometimes I have found that there's a different stage of the day that something's changed in my body, and if I compare it to what I was doing 6 months ago, the profile will be slightly different, but the overall shape of it has been fairly consistent.
Okay. And the last question, is the blue hair about diabetes?
Of course. I started doing it during lockdown a couple of years ago, and I haven't stopped.
Okay.
And it's quite funny. I go to events and people say, "Oh, you did your hair for the event," and it's like this all the time. And then we had an election last year, and one of the parties uses blue as their color, and it's not for you.
Okay, when it comes to politics, you don't talk about politics here. Okay, David. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to give you a sign when it's going to land on my YouTube channel. Thank you for your presentation. Like you said, every day is an experiment, and we have to. The best way to experiment is on ourselves and look how our diabetes and our organisms work with all of the factors we need to stay in range and hopefully live better, live longer, and healthier.
We experiment on ourselves, but part of the value in the communities is that we can compare with each other and say, why are you completely different to me? What am I missing? What's going on? So it's a little bit of both. A community experimenting on ourselves and seeing what everyone else is doing actually is a lot stronger than just trying to do it on your own.
And that's the beauty of the internet. Oh, hello, Ola. That's the beauty of the internet, that we can combine and connect and see what other people are doing, and we can communicate like this today. So, David, thank you again very much. Have a great day. Cheers from Poland to Australia to Melbourne, and we're online, and we're gonna catch up later.
Thank you very much.
Take care.